Welcome back to Campbell Kitchen, everybody. Today we're going to make brisket. Brisket is one of my favorite things to make in the world, especially Texas-style brisket when it's smoked low and slow. But today what we're going to do is we're going to bake it in the oven and try and get a similar effect. It's not going to taste smoky, but it's still going to get a nice dark char and it's going to be delicious. So right there I have a prime brisket. You can use any brisket that you'd like. I got this at Costco. It's a great deal. It's a great piece of meat. It's delicious. So I'm going to take it out of the bag and I'm just going to dry it off. So I like to make a small little cut in that bag, open it just wide enough for the meat to slip out, grab the meat with paper towels, pull it out so that remaining blood is at the bottom of the bag, get rid of the bag, dry it off. Now your next step is going to be to trim it a little bit. So what I like to do is trim off that little flap, and then I just use my knife in kind of a rounding motion, and I just kind of scrape away the excess fat. Now what you can do is you can tell how much fat there is because the fat's going to be hard. If the fat is really hard, that means it's very thick fat. And if you have soft fat, it's going to be very thin. So just use your finger. You can really tell if you've done this once or twice that some areas are very thick, some areas are very thin, and just shave away. You want to keep about a 1/4 inch of fat around all of the beef, or as much of the beef as possible. That's not always going to happen because sometimes, like you see right there, people at the plant, they make cuts, they make mistakes. Okay, but anyway, so just work your knife slowly but surely and just trim away as much fat as possible while still leaving a nice 1/4 inch. Now along one of the sides of the brisket, there's going to be kind of like a sinewy, muscly thing. I just trim that away so it's kind of like a tendon. You'll see it. Just trim it right away and then flip that baby over and just use your knife and cut away that big piece of fat right there. And I always like to use rounding motions with my knife. I don't do straight cuts, I just kind of do nice round cuts. It leaves the product looking nicer. And that thin fat on the underside of the brisket, that really is going to kind of melt away, but I know for competition, they really are particular about cutting that away. So I just trimmed some of it away, but I always like to just leave it. So usually that fat's going to kind of melt and render out. It's not really a big deal, especially at home. It's going to provide extra moisture and flavor, totally fine. But again, this brisket is prime. It's very, very fatty. It is nice to trim away a good amount of the fat. Otherwise, it's just going to be too rich and you can't eat too much. So now that it's all trimmed, let's season it up. So I'm using Mild Bill's barbecue rub. It's a barbecue rub I got online. It's pretty decent, okay? But it's, smoky, sweet, salty, all the good stuff that you want in a barbecue rub. Use any rub that you want or use salt and pepper. It really does not matter at all. Just use a lot of it. So what we're going to do is do both sides covered in this rub, as you can see. And then what I'm going to do is pack it in with my hands, and I'm just going to wrap it in plastic wrap. So once it's wrapped in plastic wrap, I'm going to let it sit in the refrigerator 6 hours, 12 hours, 1-2 days. It really doesn't matter at that point. At least 6 hours, right? Or if you're in a hurry, it really doesn't matter. I mean, you could let it sit out at room temperature for 2 hours and then throw it in the oven. Totally fine. But the important thing is to pack it with rub and let that rub kind of just seep in there. Especially because we're using different flavors like paprika and smoked chili. You really want that to penetrate the meat. So what I'm going to do is just wrap it really, really well in plastic wrap. So I just wrapped it like 4 or 5 times. I used about like 300 feet of plastic wrap. It's just kind of crazy, but that's what I had to do. And I just threw it in my fridge for 2 days. So after 2 days, I took it out and that's what it looks like. So you can tell that flavor, so I just used scissors, as you can see, that flavor has really just kind of turned into a brine. I mean, that rub is just kind of brined that meat, and that flavor is just penetrated the flesh, and it's just looking really beautiful. But again, you guys know that moisture is the enemy of color, and what we want is color. So we're gonna have to evaporate all that in the oven before it gets any color, which is totally fine. This is gonna cook like 45 minutes per pound. Make sure you add water in the pan, otherwise it's going to form a bark that's way too chewy and it's just dry and not great. So you want to make sure that you cook with moist heat and you cook low and slow. So what I like to do is add water periodically throughout the cook at least 45 minutes a pound. Allow hours and hours for this thing. You can cook it as hot as 325, but it might turn out a little bit dry. So every few hours, what I like to do is get rid of that grease right there on the flat, and that prevents coloring on the flat. So put your fork in, dump the grease in the pan, back in the oven until everything gets nice and beautiful color. So this thing's been cooking for about 6 hours at 275. It's not quite there. what I'm going to do is wrap it in butcher paper because that color is fine. So I inserted the meat thermometer. You can see it's only going to get to about 130 after 6 hours. You want it to be 195 degrees. That's your ideal temperature. 135, way too cold. But it has enough color and it's been cooking for about 4 to 6 hours. I'm gonna wrap it in butcher paper, okay? So this butcher paper is gonna let it cook really well, nice and moist, and it's gonna prevent it from getting too much color. So wrap it really well in butcher paper, back in the oven, right on top of the rack, same process, same thing, until that internal temperature is about 195. Why 195? Because that's when meat starts to get tender, that tough collagen breaks down, and it's able to chew and just pull apart, and it's really tender. So right there, 189. That was actually a little bit undercooked, but it was still fine. I just had to eat. It was in a hurry. You know, everybody wanted to eat. We were hungry, but let it get to 195. So I'm opening the beautiful butcher paper, and that is what your roast looks like. It's not too shabby. Okay, so that was like 8 hours total. And I had to rush this thing. I'd rather just go 250 for like 12 hours, but I just didn't have the time. I didn't plan ahead. Silly me. Anyway, it turned out great. So what we're gonna do is let it rest. So make sure that you let it rest as long as possible. You can let this thing rest for like 4 hours and it's still gonna be fine. Just let it rest covered in a like a insulated area, like an oven that's not hot, or like a cooler, or like an igloo cooler or a Yeti cooler. That thing's gonna be fine. It'll last forever. So let's cut it in half. Boom, super juicy. There's not too much fat. There's that big vein of fat, but other than that, it's totally fine. And it looks really good and it tastes really good. That bark is delicious. So this one I didn't rest. I should have rested it, but everybody wanted to eat. Like I said, I had guests over. They were hungry. We were ready to eat. But definitely you're gonna wanna let it rest as long as possible. This whole project, this is an all-day thing, but fortunately because it's in the oven, you don't really have to do much. So slice the point very thin, about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch slices, and then for the thick, excuse me, that's the point. The flat is what I sliced. So the thicker point, just cut in half like I did, and then I'm just gonna cut 1/4 inch slices, and that's the really well marbled part, the point. Okay, that's the fatty part. Anyway, I hope you guys like this video. Experiment, try different temperatures, different rubs. Let me know in the comments below how it turned out. Thanks for watching. Have an awesome day.